Today is Sunday, August 15th, 2021. 50 years ago today, on a Sunday evening, when most of the world's financial markets were closed, then President Richard Nixon interrupted the NBC hit TV Western Bonanza to inform the world that 184 years after the Founding Fathers put America on a gold standard, that he was taking it off, at least temporarily. That's what he said anyway. On that night, Nixon declared that foreign holders of U.S. Federal Reserve notes, popularly known as U.S. dollars, could no longer be redeemed in gold. In fact, up until 1933, the U.S. dollar was legally defined as a specific weight of gold. So Federal Reserve notes were not technically dollars themselves. They were obligations of the Federal Reserve to pay dollars. But in 1933, during the Great Depression, FDR suspended the convertibility of Federal Reserve notes into dollars, magically transforming obligations to pay dollars into dollars themselves, except these new dollars were made of paper rather than gold. However, up until August 15th of 1971, at least foreign governments that held those paper dollars in reserve could still redeem them for physical gold. So those paper dollars still sat on the books of the Federal Reserve as liabilities. Alternatively, those paper dollars were still assets to foreign central banks, as they could be redeemed on demand in physical gold. Foreign central banks held dollars instead of gold based solely on the Federal Reserve's promise to redeem them in gold. In other words, the dollar was no longer made of gold, but it was as good as gold. But when Nixon broke the promise to pay gold, the U.S. effectively defaulted on Federal Reserve notes, turning U.S. currency into monopoly money. And foreign governments that held those notes, expecting to be paid gold, were told they would be paid nothing. Now, when Nixon made this announcement, he actually sold it to the public as a positive step forward. But in reality, it was a massive leap backwards. I even hesitate to refer to today as a 50-year anniversary, as the term anniversary generally denotes something positive, like a wedding. We don't want to honor this day. We want to remember it the way we remember Pearl Harbor, except it was the U.S. government that bombed its own people with fiat money. It was honest money that kept Americans free by placing fiscal restraints on the federal government. The inability to create dollars without gold backing them up was a powerful check on the growth of government. It limited government's ability to spend, and more importantly, its ability to go into debt. Now, during the decade of the 1960s, despite its unprecedented global economic dominance and industrial might, the U.S. government finally ran up against those limits. Lyndon Johnson had launched a war on poverty, which poverty won with Great Society programs like Medicare and Medicaid, while also waging a shooting war in Vietnam. Oh, and by the way, we lost that war too. And we funded the Apollo space program, ultimately landing men on the moon in 1969. But back on Earth, the U.S. government lacked the money to pay for both guns and butter, so it began running large deficits to cover the shortfall, which the Federal Reserve promptly monetized. In other words, the Federal Reserve was actually doing quantitative easing decades before the term would actually be coined. But our foreign creditors got wise. They knew the U.S. was issuing more Federal Reserve notes than it had gold to back them up. Foreign central banks began redeeming their Federal Reserve notes for gold, the biggest drain coming from France. If the U.S. kept spending and the Fed kept printing, the United States would have lost all of its gold reserves. So Nixon faced a difficult political choice to prevent that from happening. One option was to allow deflation and to cut government spending, or maybe raise taxes dramatically, or some combination of the two, turning those large budget deficits into surpluses, thus enabling the Federal Reserve to withdraw from circulation all of those extra notes that had been put into circulation to finance prior deficits, this would have forced the U.S. into a severe recession, and it would have allowed consumer prices to fall back down to levels that would have been consistent with a $35 gold price. Now, the second option was a major devaluation of the dollar. This would have meant that the official gold price would have had to have been raised to a level much higher. That would have been consistent with the greater supply of Federal Reserve notes, and it would have matched the increase in prices of other goods and services that had already resulted from the massive inflation that the Federal Reserve had already created to fund government spending. However, even this embarrassing option, if chosen, would have required government to bring deficits under control to prevent future devaluations from having to take place. Now, since neither of these options was politically appealing, Nixon found an expedient way out. He defaulted. He actually cheated. He stopped the gold drain not by reimposing fiscal responsibility, but simply by closing the gold window. And despite his initial claim that this move was just temporary, the window has remained shut ever since. Nixon's initial plan was to reopen the window with a higher gold price. But after two devaluations that raised the official price of gold to $42.22 by February of 1973, Nixon realized that a far greater devaluation would be required. And since that was politically unthinkable, the temporary closure became permanent. The economic consequences were clear. Initially, without gold backing, the purchasing power of Federal Reserve notes collapsed. Prices soared. By 1980, the price of gold had risen from $35 an ounce to $850. The price of oil rose from just under $3 a barrel in 1970 to just under $40 in 1980. As consumer prices soared, the economy stagnated. The economic condition that actually confounded Keynesian economists, who at the time thought a combination of high inflation and high unemployment was impossible, became known as stagflation. The loss of purchasing power took a heavy toll on American paychecks. Prior to the 1970s, a married American man could support a family. It didn't matter the type of job that he had, if he had a college degree, or even a high school diploma. A grown American man working a full-time job could support a wife and his children on a single paycheck, and he can do it all without going into debt. But the inflation of the 1970s so eroded the value of those paychecks that by the 1980s, married women were forced to enter the workforce in droves to make up for the loss. And this represented a significant decline in the American standard of living. The US dollar itself, now backed by nothing, lost about 70% of its value relative to other foreign currencies before finally stabilizing under the combination of then President Ronald Reagan and then Fed Chief Paul Volcker, during which interest rates initially rose as high as 20% to stop the bleeding. Once confidence in a dollar without gold backing was restored, the stagflation of the 1970s finally came to an end in the 1980s. But even though the dollar was no longer backed by gold, it remained the world's reserve currency, though at a much lower exchange rate than when it had been backed by gold. So the dollar was marked down, but it was not counted out as the world's reserve currency. But once the US government could spend and borrow without the discipline formally imposed by gold, it abused the privilege. Also, the ability of the Federal Reserve to print the world's reserve currency without Americans having to actually produce anything of real value to back it up empowered consumers to live well beyond their means. They could exchange the paper dollars that the Fed printed for the real goods the rest of the world produced. So our industrial base gradually withered away as our factories were replaced by strip malls and high-wage factory workers were supplanted by low-wage sales clerks. The era of cheap money also transformed a nation of once frugal savers into one of reckless spenders. The U.S. went on a borrowing and spending binge. Our large trade surpluses turned into enormous trade deficits, And the United States went from being the world's largest creditor nation to its biggest debtor. In fact, the United States owes more money than all the other debtor nations of the world combined. And the national debt soared from just under $400 billion in 1971 to over $28 trillion today. And we now stand on the precipice of an inflationary collapse that will make the stagflation of the 1970s look like the roaring 20s by comparison. It was 50 years ago today that the U.S. went off the gold standard, but soon the world will go off the dollar standard. And for Americans, the economic and financial consequences will be even more devastating. Just like Charles de Gaulle of France could read the writing on the wall back in the 1960s, we can read that writing today. The quantitative easing that began following the 2008 financial crisis far exceeds the QE program of the 1960s. Gold is as underpriced today in 2021 as it was 50 years ago in 1971. In fact, on the same day that Nixon took us off the gold standard, he also announced a misguided effort to control inflation with the temporary imposition of wage and price controls. And the reason for such a draconian move was that the government and the entire nation had become very concerned about an annual inflation rate that for the first time exceeded 4%. Now, it's important to point out that today's official annual inflation rate already well exceeds that rate, and it would exceed it by a much larger margin if we still measured prices using the same CPI that we used to measure them back then. But this time, instead of taking aggressive action to address the problem, the government simply dismisses it as being transitory. Just like Charles de Gaulle exchanged France's Federal Reserve notes for gold, now's the time for you to do the same thing with yours. While it's important to remember what happened back on August 15th, 1971, it's even more important to learn from the mistakes those Americans made who failed to protect themselves from the inflation Nixon's decision to go off the gold standard unleashed. The inflation that we're about to experience when the world goes off the dollar standard will be far worse. So contact your Schiff Gold representative today and exchange your fiat money for real money before it's too late.